friends and fellow bakers, how are you doing? It's Chef Tom from chefinstructortom.com. Thanks for checking in on the channel this week. Well, have you ever made a cake or a sweet pastry that didn't rise, didn't do so well, or maybe it kind of fell in the middle like mine did last week? Yeah, it happens to us all. Chemical leaveners are amazing, but they can be tricky. And that's what we're going to look into today is chemical leaveners. Too much and your product tastes funny and has weird texture. Not enough and your product is dense and tastes bad. Either way, it's bad. As you know, accuracy in baking is key, and today we're going to talk about how to make chemical leaveners work better for you. Well, let's get straight what chemical leaveners are. They produce CO2 gas and help raise your product so it's not dense. Simple as that. They make cookies softer, they make cakes rise. There is a slight sodium component to it, so they help regulate flavor as well. But more about that in a little bit. Chemical leaveners, and in this case we mean baking soda and baking powder. There are other ones, but these are the two main ones we're going to use in modern baking. Why do some recipes call for one or the other, or sometimes both? Well, you have to know what's in each one to kind of figure out that question. So let's talk about baking soda first. It's sodium bicarbonate, or some people might call it bicarbonate of soda. But it occurs naturally and is either mined or is produced commercially. When it's combined with an acid, the combination produces CO2 gas and your product rises. Pretty cool, right? This is something that we use in baking every single day. This is especially helpful to the baker because we use all kinds of acids in our baking just in normal usage for flavor and texture, and just because we like the flavor of acid. Think of things like sour cream, buttermilk, yogurt, lemon juice. They all have enough acid to activate that baking soda to produce the CO2. But even lower acid sources like brown sugar or even banana can help make that CO2 gas come out as well. But the catch is the CO2 gas is fleeting. Once it's produced, it's up and it's gone, and you gotta go. You have to mix the product and bake it soon to catch all that gas. If you use too much, the product will rise, but it won't have enough structure to support itself, and it'll fall back in the middle. That's what happened to me last week. The dreaded sunken cake. What a bummer that is. If you don't use enough, the product won't rise at all. And this happens a lot of times when it gets kind of old and it just doesn't rise. You probably have had a very dense cake. You gotta follow the recipe exactly. The person who wrote it tested it many, many times, or at least they should have, to get the right weight of baking soda for your product. This is really important too. Another problem is that for home baking is we're dealing with such small amounts that it's really hard to dial in exactly how much will be needed. Now, you know me, I like weight for all things, and I will weigh my baking soda if it's a little bit more, but if it's just a tiny little bit, I'll probably go with a teaspoon. The standard teaspoon will be more accurate in this case for chemical leaveners. And I can't believe I'm actually saying that. But baking soda is often measured in teaspoons, even when we're dealing with weight. Now, baking soda, like I said, has that slight salty component to it. It gives you a little salty taste to it. But the CO2 it produces is tasteless and colorless. It's just there to make the cake rise or the cookie softer. So when you're done, there's no aftertaste or residue, which then now brings me to baking powder. Now, baking powder was developed to work with products that don't have any acid in them at all, or at least very little. You see, baking powder has acids, multiple acids, built into it. Dry acid that is activated when you add liquid and add heat to it. Pretty ingenious for baking, right? Because we use both liquids and heat every time we bake. Well, let me back up a little bit. Baking powder is really baking soda and dry acid. Yeah, there's baking soda in baking powder. Blows the mind, right? The acids that are commonly found in baking powder are sodium aluminum phosphate and monocalcium phosphate. Both those sound pretty nasty, don't they? But they do occur naturally, and they're just the acids there to produce the CO2 gas when you combine them with the baking soda. But this is super handy because you can get more gas as the cake bakes to a higher temperature. Each acid reacts at a different temperature. I mean, it's all dialed in. It totally makes sense. Baking powder does the same thing baking soda does, but it allows you to delay the baking by a little bit. It also allows you to choose not to bake with acid. Now, why you'd want to bake without acid, I don't know, because I love baking with acid. There is a small cost, however, in that if you use too much, your product will have a slightly off taste, sort of like a metallic flavor to it. You might have tasted this before in muffins or something. You get some blueberry muffins and you go, these taste kind of funny. It's not pleasant at all. So the trick is to be accurate. I'd say that's a pretty small price to pay. Now, the question I always get is, why do I have to use both baking soda and baking powder in the same recipe? Why did they write both those in there? That's a good question, and that's a valid question a lot of bakers have. Well, bakers, through trial and error, have figured out when you need a little bit more gas production in your product. It's trial and error. You're gonna work through the recipe numerous times. Perhaps you have some acid, but not enough to make the product rise all the way. You'll probably see some baking powder in the formula just to give that final little bit of lift to it. I personally, if I'm developing a formula, will develop it with baking soda. I like that really clean flavor to it. I'm going to use acid in most of my products anyway. I use sour cream, lemon juice, brown sugar in most of my products anyway. Like I said, it's a clean flavor, and there's nothing wrong with baking powder though. I have to say, you can use baking powder as your sole leavener with no ill effect at all on flavor or texture. So I hope I have cleared up some misconceptions and put you at ease in using baking soda and baking powder in your products. And now you know all I know about chemical leaveners, which is not everything. You can do a little more research if you wanted to, and I recommend you do. But now it's time for you to bake. I will see you next time on chefinstructortom.com. Happy baking.